Hey guys, welcome to the second edition of Amnic Cast. Today we have an esteemed guest like Nilesh Gule, who is an accomplished architect in a leading bank in Singapore. Welcome, Nilesh. So, why don't you start with a brief introduction of your journey?
Yeah, thanks, Sathya. So, as you said, my name is Nilesh Gule. I was born and brought up in Goa. I did all my schooling, everything in Goa, and people really get surprised when they hear that I'm from Goa and what am I doing in IT. But somehow, IT has been my passion for more than 2 decades. And I started my career in the Silicon Valley of India, Bangalore or Bangalore as it is called now. Uh, I started off as a .NET developer, and then as my career progressed, I've taken up different roles like tech lead. Then I led a team, started a team from 3 members, grew it all the way to 30 members. Did large scale projects, distributed projects, like big projects, and did team management. But somehow the techie in me was always willing to go back to the tech side of things, and that's where I reverted back to being an architect about 7 or 8 years back. And since then, I never thought about going back in the management line. Now I pride myself being an architect and someone who is quite active in the community. So for my community contributions, I've been rewarded with Microsoft MVP since 2018. And
Nice.
recently, I'm also rewarded as the first Docker captain in Singapore. So
Wow.
those are like two prestigious things personally for me. It's just a recognition of my efforts that I put in to share my knowledge with the broader community. I like technology. I explore tech as much as possible within the limited amount of time that I get. And when I'm not thinking or talking about technology, I really enjoy the game of cricket.
Awesome. So, you're waiting for today's match then?
Yes, of course.
Awesome. Awesome. So, Nilesh, I think some of the things that we have been discussing, right? I think you have done like really large scale migration projects, right? So why don't you take us through in terms of your experience building these large scale migration? What are some of the do's and don'ts, and what are some of the best practices that people can adopt while they are doing this?
Yeah. Maybe I can start with a sort of step back and look at how things were done in the past and when we were doing big migration projects. I remember back in 2007, 2008, I used to work for the biggest retail in UK, and
Mhm.
we were working on .NET that time. And .NET was at that point in time like releasing a major version, let's say every 1.5 or 2 years, and we were still lagging in terms of upgrading all our applications to the latest version of .NET. One of the reason for that was there were like more than 3,000 physical stores, and somebody had to go and upgrade the version of .NET
Right.
on all those 3,000 servers. Imagine someone has to do that in a period of 3 months. It would take at least 3 to 6 months for all those 3,000 stores to be upgraded from, let's say, .NET 1.1 version to 2.0. And the cycle would repeat every few years. Every time Microsoft
Yep.
came up with the next version of .NET, you had to go through this rigorous process of somebody going into the store, upgrading, and it was a tedious process. You look at it now, it's become so easy. Automation is taken over. Cloud is another factor which is making things in terms of uh, implementing solutions and innovations very, very fast. Now we don't even wait for like hours. Within minutes, we can spin up the kind of infrastructure that we need. We can use things like Ansible, Terraform, or whatever automation tool or
Mhm.
technology that we are familiar with or we would like to use with a preferred cloud provider, and it becomes very easy. So, in terms of, I think if you're talking about big migrations, the major change I have seen is over the years, people moving from physical hardware or infrastructure to virtual ones in data centers first, and then gradually with the advent of cloud, now people are using cloud as another option, which gives them really the hyperscale capabilities. We are not thinking too much now in terms of what should be our investment for, let's say, racks for 3 years, 5 years kind of
Mhm.
thing, which used to be the case when we were right sizing, let's say, 10 years back. Now it's more about, okay, what can we do with this VM for next 6 months? Because we know that the cloud provider is going to optimize it in the next big keynote that they're going to present. So that's the change I am seeing in terms of attitude of the people, that mindset of people is also shifting in terms of how fast they can deliver software and risk taking as well. Before we were thinking more about fail safe approach where everything has to be like 100% up and running. You were looking at 100% availability, but now people are more and more accustomed to accepting the fact that there would be failure, but we should be able to recover from those failures and respond more quickly to any problems that might occur. So I think things like observability, SRE, DevOps, these kind of changes that have come in last 1 decade or so, they've really helped to improve the overall software lifecycle and the tool chain, which makes life easier for everyone, I would say, not just the developers or the operators, but even for business. It
Hmm.
makes them, it gives them that flexibility that we can do things like A/B testing. We don't have to release a software for whole of our customer base. We can gradually increase the customer base, go, let's say, do what they call as dark launches, or you do progressive delivery where you increase your blast radius from, let's say, 20% to 40%, then 60%. So these kind of things, they are now a reality, and that is what I see a change in the way people are really going to deploy software. It's not there everywhere. Obviously, there
Hmm.
is a lot of people who are still on-prem, but I think COVID was another factor, in my opinion, which really did force many of the industries and companies to look at how they can transform themselves. And I still remember the joke when someone asked, "What caused transformation in your organization?" And it is not the CTO or CFO, but it is rather COVID who forced them to transform.
Nice. You also have a very unique experience in terms of doing migration from on-prem to cloud, and you had a lot of best practices around that, right? Can
Yeah.
you share a bit on like how did you think about moving from on-prem to cloud, right? Lift and shift, modernization, right?
Yeah, I've been in a couple of organizations at least where I was one of the first team member to get into the teams who are doing who are starting the migration journey. In the first case, it was more around reducing the footprint in the data center of all the servers and the infra resources that we had. So in that case, we were looking at lift and shift kind of approach where you still run similar kind of application without making too many changes to the existing setup, but move it from the physical data center or from the company owned data center to a public cloud. The other reason for this was also to look at things like cost reduction, because cloud gives you those capabilities where you can automate a lot of things which are not so easy to do on an on-premise kind of setup. You have this auto scaling capabilities where, let's say, you have some processes which run in a batch mode. Let's assume you are a financial organization and you have some processes which run towards the end of the month. In a typical on-prem setup, you would still keep those servers running and you would have them like very high spec. You don't really need them all the time, right?
Mm.
Whereas in cloud, we get this ability to have creation of like a bare minimum setup, which will run for, let's say, 75% of the time. And only during last 1 week, you really make use of that. And when that burst happens, or when you have that timely or a scheduled overload, you can do scaling based on time. For example, you can scale the resources for that particular server group or server farm only for a period of 1 week or 10 days, and then you can bring it back. The other area is where you have a very dynamic kind of workload. Typically, we see this in retail organizations nowadays, where every month you have some or the other promotion. Like typically in Singapore, 1/1, 2/2, 3/3, all these dates which come on every month, they
Mm.
have promotions happening. And then obviously all the big ticket items like the Christmas, Deepavali, every festival, they run these promotions where you know that at certain point in time, only for a very short duration, you're going to get this huge peak of orders or requests or people flocking your site or mobile application, and then rest of the time there is not much work. So these are typical scenarios where cloud really helps you to go auto scaling way, and it's baked into the cloud services. You don't really have to think too much. It's more of a configuration, I would say, just to enable saying, yeah, these are the parameters when I want to enable auto scaling, and the cloud provider will take care of that. So that makes things very easy, and that is what I've seen being implemented in the projects that I've run. In terms of challenges here, right, the biggest challenge is the change in the mindset where people have to think about building cloud native applications. You cannot use the same application which was running on prem and shift it to cloud and expect that, okay, it's going to run, and you are going to use scalability of cloud, and it's going to give you, let's say, more benefits. The application has to be designed that way. So there are these changes which are required on the part of, let's say, the architect or the person who is designing the infrastructure, and also developer, to make the application to use the cloud patterns, I would say, which is not just for the cloud. You can even run them on, let's say, you are running OpenShift, for example. Kubernetes is quite popular now. It's more of the patterns which are required for building cloud native applications. And when I talk about cloud, I don't want to give the impression that this is applicable only in public cloud. You can still apply those concepts in things like running OpenShift applications or running Kubernetes on premise, and it would still work. You can still do auto scaling on your on premise based setup. So I would say those are the two main things where people have to change the mindset and really look at exploring and implementing the cloud native technologies and build applications which are utilizing the cloud native patterns. Just shifting the application doesn't really help.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. But one thing is like when you do this, right? Now, on one hand, you have a pressure of moving things to cloud. On the other hand, you also have to make it a little more cloud native to move there. In your experience, have you seen like what? How do you do this, right? Like, is one winning over the other, or can you tell the organization, hey, we will have to modernize it and then take it? Like,
The approach is mostly in phased manner, where in order to get everybody onboarded, right, we start with a very small application, which is easier to lift and shift, and
Mhm,
you start to see the benefits of it.
mhm,
The first thing we would do is to look at resource needs and to see if what is there running on, let's say, on premise with, let's take a ASP.NET based application, for example. It might be running on a web server with 32 GB of RAM. When we move it to cloud, do we really need 32 GB of RAM all the time?
mhm,
That's the kind of questions I would start with. And then also monitor, because if you ask the application team, more often than not, they would be saying, no, no, we have the load, we can show you this, it has to be 32 GB. But if you really look at the resource utilization, you will realize that maybe they are utilizing only 5 or 10% of the resources.
yeah, yeah,
So I would start with monitoring the resource usage and also putting in things around the cost. Like most of the cloud providers, by default, they have a costing factor. Right? They have some way or the other which allows you to monitor the cost, which allows you to set alerts. And those are the kind of things I will use to see what is the actual usage and then adjust based on that. So it's more of a proactive way of monitoring your cost rather than waiting for the bill to come after 6 months and realize that, oh, you're not getting any benefit of moving
yeah,
to cloud.
yeah,
In fact, you're spending more. But
yeah.
my first advice to anyone who is willing to migrate to cloud is think about what is your cost optimization strategy and look at the resource monitoring. How much resources you're using? Are you utilizing them in the most appropriate way?
Got it. I think you touched upon very two important topics, right? One is observability, right? When
Yes.
you say monitoring, the way you monitor on your on-prem and the way you probably make it more container native is very different, right?
Yes.
How did you go about doing that, right? Like from monitoring the systems on-prem, right? How different was it when you moved to the cloud native stuff?
When we talk about cloud native nowadays, we also see a shift in the trend where most of the organizations are also willing to bet on open source projects, right? Which was not the case, let's say, 20 years back. Open source was more for hobbyists, I would say, but now it's become more of a mainstream.
Yeah.
So you see platforms being built on top of open source.
Mm.
Kubernetes, for example, is an
Yeah.
open source project, and then we have this whole suite of ecosystem built around Kubernetes.
Mm.
So I think open source software usage has increased quite a lot, and that has helped to bring in many of these innovative projects. Like if we talk about observability, something like Elastic Stack. You have Elasticsearch, Kibana for visualization.
Yeah.
You have for Matrix, Prometheus, which is like one of the most commonly used tool. You have Grafana for visualization. So these kind of projects, they really help the teams to move faster in terms of observability. And if I look at the cloud providers, although they have their own native solutions, like Azure has Azure Monitor, AWS has similar capabilities, and every cloud provider has their own monitoring solution, and they provide native observability solution. But they also support these open source tools, like a managed offering of Grafana is available,
Yeah.
managed offering of Prometheus is available. What I see as a change compared to when I started my career is, again, in terms of the way we observe or monitor the applications. Back 20 years, it was maybe just three places we had to look if there was an issue. There was a front end, some web server running the application, then maybe an application server to host your middle tier, and then database. But now, if you look, everything has distributed.
Mhm.
Your application is distributed. If you enable auto scaling, if you use things like Kubernetes, your application might be running in 10 different places. Same thing applies for databases, caches, whatever we use.
Yeah.
So the blast radius, it increases drastically.
Yep.
And it is almost impossible to use the primitive method of just looking at logs.
Correct.
You will never be able to identify the root cause. I can tell you now, if you are running microservices based application and you just rely on logs. I know some teams, they say I have logging enabled, so I am observable, but that's a wrong impression to give. Logging is definitely needed. We do need logs, but if we look at observability, there are three main things which are required. First, obviously, is your distributed tracing, because your call now traverses through multiple hops. You need a way to identify uh, what is going wrong and where it is going wrong. That is where you need something like Jaeger or any other solution which gives you that end-to-end trace, saying, I started my call here, it went through these three or four microservices, then it landed on this particular database, and how much time was taken. The other thing is the matrix. Matrix will give you more granular or aggregated level values, saying, okay, how is the system behaving? So when you look at your application's overall time for processing, let's say you are doing payment processing, it can tell you by looking at the matrix, what is the mean time, what is like the average time, what are the kind of outliers. And when you see something which is not as per the expected uh, lines, that is where you start to look at next level, which is like distributed tracing. You would want to say, okay, something is going wrong in my payment processor. Now, which area of payment processing pipeline is giving me a problem? Once you reach there, you might identify one of the component, and then you need to find what exactly is going in inside that component. That is where logging will help you. So I think that is the crux of the observability nowadays, where not relying on just one source of information, you need all these multiple dimensions. I'm mentioning here three, but there might be more than these three. You
Mhm.
need to combine these to get to a easier solution. And I would say by making these managed offerings, cloud providers are making it easy for organizations and people to onboard onto these faster. We don't have to really have too much of expertise in these areas. We don't have to have people who know these tools very well, but we as end users can still provision these services and make use of them to make our applications more, I would say, scalable, observable, and to have all these elastic capabilities.
Awesome. Very well articulated in terms of how you actually make it more like traceable and be able to debug it in a faster way, right? The other thing you touched upon is the cost optimization part of it. One part you explained very well in terms of, hey, when you start looking at cloud, you need to look at elasticity kind of stuff, right? Are
Yes.
there any other things that you look for? One is the compute part of it. Anything that you look for, like, hey, when you go to cloud, these are all the top five or things that I actually look at for cost optimization.
Yes, definitely. As I said initially, I would start with a small application first to get everybody uh, experience with the cloud. Everyone in the organization, from the developer, DevOps, SRE, then the guys who are managing the infra, finance, all these people, they need to understand how cloud is helping them, right? So the best way is to pick some application which is, let's say, not very, very critical, and you can easily migrate it. Once you have done that, once you have got the feel of it, then you start to look at opportunities where you can optimize cloud further. And that is where I would look at things like databases, for example. If you're running, let's say, SQL Server in your on-premise, what benefit you can get by moving it to cloud and using the SQL cloud offering.
Mm-hmm.
It's a small refactoring that you have to do, but
Mm-hmm.
then the benefits that you get might be quite big, because you don't have to manage the SQL Server locally. You get all these benefits in terms of machine learning capabilities that the cloud provides, the security, all these added benefits which come because cloud is for thousands of organizations. They have hardened it to a much better extent than what an organization can do themselves. So I think in these cases where we look at security, cloud is much more advanced, and it gives that good uh, kickstart for teams who are moving their on-premise applications to cloud. And in some cases, it is just a flag to say, yes, I want to use this feature. Encryption, for example. If you were to do encryption, it could take quite a long time to do it on premise, but on cloud you just say, I have my encryption key, or I'm going to bring my encryption key, use this and encrypt my data when you store it in, let's say, a storage area. So those are the kind of things I look at in terms of, I have an application, I can move it to cloud, but other than just moving to cloud, what are the services or the benefits I can achieve by moving it to cloud? So definitely refactoring to use managed database offering, or if you're using messaging, for example, using managed messaging frameworks like uh, Kafka, for example, is available as managed offering. If you're using RabbitMQ, that is available as managed offering. So your cost in terms of managing those infra services gets reduced. You still need to know people who understand how to use those services, but in terms of things like upgrade, patching, all that headache reduces. The challenge over there again is you are now shifting from managing it all yourself to keeping up pace with the cloud. Because if you look at Kubernetes, every 3 months they come up with a new release.
Okay, yeah.
So there is still a challenge. You need to keep up that pace, which might not be a factor on premise. You can say, I'm going to use the same .NET version for next 5 years, but on cloud you might not be able to do that. So I would say it's a trade-off, but a good trade-off to have, because everyone wants to move in most cases to the latest and greatest technologies, right? And cloud gives us that flexibility. I can have that pace of innovation. If I can keep up with the cloud provider, then it's a very good proposition in my opinion.
Yeah, and
I also look at one more thing when you talk about cost, especially around storage. Storage is another area where many people use it more as a backup kind of solution, moving away from like NAS or any local storage to a cloud storage, uh, because of the obvious cost reduction. And when we move applications to cloud, I think that is where another pointer I give to most of the teams, that if you're using anything in terms of storage of data or files, look at the option to use this lifecycle management where you can move from a hot tier to a warm tier and cold tier, and utilize that benefit of automatically doing it by making use of cloud services. That can help you to reduce the cost quite a lot. The other thing in terms of costing is something like reserve instances. If you know what is the number of resources or number of servers you are going to use for a period of time, you can go for 1 year or 3 years lock-in, saying I am going to commit to this, and every cloud provider will give you reduced pricing on those committed number of services.
awesome. That's pretty informative, right? And you have been in fintech, you have seen e-commerce. How do you compare the stacks? Like when you architect for, let's say, fintech, what are the things that you look for and the best practices? When you look for e-commerce, how does the stack actually differ, and what do you actually look at?
Historically, I think there were typical stacks in different industries. But again, with cloud, I see those stacks becoming less of a issue, and more people are moving towards similar kind of technology stack. Let's say something which is based on Kubernetes, as an example.
Mm.
So if you are using container-based application, then the whole thing of using an open container initiative for building your images makes it like one standard. If you have that, then deploying that OCI compliant image on any Kubernetes distribution is, again, a sort of standardization where once you do it in one industry, it doesn't matter whether you change from finance to insurance, from insurance to banking, banking to retail. The process is almost the same. So I think some of these recent technologies, they are making it easier for technologists or people who are deploying and developing applications easier in terms of the way applications are built and the way they are deployed and managed. So historically, some industries, they were more inclined towards, let's say, .NET kind of development, or some were more inclined towards Java. Typically, if you are doing more of server-side processing, Java was more prominent, and if you are doing more of front end, then you would see some .NET prominence there. But recently, I think those things are not that obvious. People are moving more and more towards mobile-based applications. Microservices is another reason where you don't have to stick to one technology stack. Even within the same application, you can have polyglot programming, and based on your kind of application needs, you can use more than one programming language in the same application. So I see that as a big shift or change in the way applications are developed now, especially because of microservices.
Got it. On the polyglot, right? Just a follow up question. When you use a polyglot, some of these observability and how you instrument and all those things also changes. How do you take care of that one? Like as an architect, right? How do you enforce that? Hey, I have the same level of observability and everything across all these things.
Yeah. Uh, it's a very good question that you have, because the way different programming languages or different frameworks they support observability, it could differ in terms of their maturity. Even if we look at something like OpenTelemetry, which is a more recent thing, where they are trying to standardize the things around what should go into the observable side of things. Typically, what I was mentioning earlier, the traces, the logs, and your spans, as well as the third component. There is logs, trace, metrics. So instead of relying on every programming language and every framework having their own version of observable component, like a trace in .NET is different from a trace in Java, from a trace in
Mm.
Python or Go. What OpenTelemetry is trying to do is to say this is how a trace should look, irrespective of what your programming language is. And me as an architect, I would be looking at something which is more open standard like that. So
Right.
as long as you are conforming to open standard, it doesn't matter what we use as a backend storage. Say, for example, logs. If you are using something like OpenTelemetry, it doesn't matter for OpenTelemetry, the agent that is collecting these logs, whether you are using uh, Elastic or whether you are using Loki for storing and visualizing those. As long as it is conformant to the OpenTelemetry standard, backend can be swapped anywhere. So in your development, you might be using Elastic. Just a hypothetical example, should not happen, but let's
Mhm.
assume you are using Elastic, but in your production, you want to use Loki. It's just a switch in terms of configuration. And because it is conforming to a standard, you can deploy the application in two different environments with two different backends. So for me, I look at that kind of thing. Typically, if you want to avoid the vendor lock-in, look at something which is more of a standard. REST, for example, when we are building the microservices, look at a common minimum protocol or standard which helps us to deploy it anywhere. We shouldn't be in a position that it works on one cloud, and then if you have to deploy the same application on another cloud and you have to spend enormous amount of effort to make it portable on that cloud, it doesn't make sense. So you should look for something which gives you that flexibility and ability that with minimal configuration change you can deploy it anywhere.
Awesome. And anything that you can think of, hey, these are the top five things that when you architect on cloud, these are my checklist in terms of how you should do, whether you're migrating or you're doing on the cloud. Make sure that these top five things or six things that I would always want to ensure that everybody follows, right? What would those be?
I would start with first thing is your right sizing. Make sure you have the right kind of infrastructure in place to support the needs of your application. Along with the right sizing, you need to have that financial aspect of monitoring it from
Mm,
the finance point of view. That
mm,
you need to have the limits set properly to make sure that you are not going above or you are not going way beyond your expected budgets. So budgeting and the financing aspect is the next one. The third thing is to make sure that you're using the right services. Like we were just talking about earlier, how do we make sure that
yeah.
we architect it properly? So don't go into solutions which are very cloud specific or cloud provider specific. To have something which is replaceable or which is swappable kind of thing. Because the way in which I see now is people were first initially thinking whether I should go to cloud.
Mm,
Now, in last 5 years, people have started moving to cloud, whether willingly or unwillingly, but cloud usage is increasing. The third thing that is going to happen is, am I on the right cloud? So
mm,
if you are not on the right cloud, I've seen companies move from one cloud to another because for some reason or the other. So in such situations, we shouldn't have something which is locking us with the particular cloud provider. So try to make services as much as possible that they are adaptable or they are replaceable with minimal configuration. And then observability is obviously the biggest thing I would say. You can never rely on traditional methods of observing the applications when you're moving to cloud native applications and cloud based applications. So you need to spend time, effort, and money in terms of building your capabilities for observing the applications rightly.
awesome,
And
Nilesh.
automation is the last one I would say,
Mm,
because cloud gives you that big advantage in terms of automating everything. You
mm,
can do almost anything on cloud using the APIs or CLIs, and you
yeah.
don't really need people to log into the portal and do click stuff. I would say that's another area where people should really invest
Mhm.
their time and effort to learn about automation.
Awesome. I think you have covered quite a few aspects on the cloud in terms of reliability, observability, how do you migrate, cost optimization. I think amazing, right? So thanks a lot, Nilesh, for joining us on this live streaming, and it's great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure sharing some of these things. Thanks a lot for having me.